Welcome everybody to tonight's program. I'm Andrew Berman, Executive Director of Village Preservation, and tonight's program is called "Why Are We Pushing Housing Policies That Harm Affordability and Preservation?" A question you would think we wouldn't have to ask, but it's all too necessary, and we're going to get into that tonight. First, a couple of words about Village Preservation. We are a neighborhood-based 501c3 nonprofit founded in 1980. Our mission is to document, celebrate, and protect the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We rely on member support, so if you like what we do, please become a member or make a donation. And among the many things that we do, in addition to advocating for preserving our neighborhoods, are programs like this. We do about 75 or more of them every night. Leanne and Maya, who are running tonight's program behind the scenes, are in charge of the wonderful array of programming we do. So find out more about upcoming programs, and we'd be thrilled to have you join us. So starting on tonight's program, and the theme for this evening's conversation, as many of you are probably aware, right now at virtually every level of city and state government, there are proposals afoot to try to dramatically increase the amount of housing and the size of housing that can be built in New York City. The number of proposals are almost head spinning, and they're pretty dramatic in their scope. And in fact, next week, there's probably going to be some important decisions made in Albany on this front. So it really does, it's very timely, and it has a really important impact on us. I should mention, as we get underway with this discussion, we're going to have questions and answers, but they're going to be at the end. So save your Q&A for then, and you can drop those questions into the Q&A, but wait until the presentation is done. Your question might be answered before then. If you have technical questions, drop it into the chat, and Leanne and Maya will see them, and they will try to respond to them and help you out. So to frame this conversation a little bit, I care deeply about the character, history, scale, architecture, diversity of our neighborhoods. But I also am somebody who cares a lot about the issue of affordability. I've grown up in New York City my entire life. I grew up in the city, and in fact, the country's largest affordable housing development. And my time before and outside of Village Preservation, a lot of it was spent on working on issues around housing and affordability. So I've been particularly interested in these issues that have come up to the fore recently around proposals to supposedly address affordability in ways that unfortunately seem to dramatically clash with the desire to preserve the scale and character of our neighborhoods. As I've dug into this, because I am genuinely interested in figuring out what the best way is to do both, what I found is a mountain of evidence that these proposals that are supposed to address affordability would in fact likely do the exact opposite. At best would not help. At worst, in all likelihood, would actually hurt considerably in terms of equity and affordability, and certainly would destroy history, scale, character of neighborhoods. These images you see on your screen now, if you're wondering what they have in common, among other things, each one of them is among the tallest building in their neighborhood, borough, or even the city. In at least one case, Central Park Tower, just at the lower left, or one off from the lower left, I should say. Really, if you take away the antenna from One World Trade Center, it's the tallest tower in the city. There's a very active proposal being considered in Albany right now to lift, these are all residential buildings, by the way, to lift a 60-year-old cap on the allowable size of residential developments in New York City. Now, all of these stick out like a sore thumb, huge, in many cases, behemoth-like residential developments were all built under that existing cap, which many advocates and the governor say is too restrictive. We need to be able to build bigger than all of these buildings that you're seeing on your screen right now. And if in fact they do lift the cap, it will allow the city to zone areas for even much larger development than these examples here. And that's part of what we're facing. And these proposals are based upon the contention that maximizing housing development will bring prices down for everybody and increase affordability for New York City. It's also based on the contention that a lack of market rate construction is at the root of our city's unaffordability challenges, and that restrictions on large scale development cause unaffordability. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, the city put out this brief that was meant to sort of really highlight this issue. And if you look closely, and by the way, some of you may have heard my presentation about the City of Yes a couple of weeks ago at the Human Scale City Forum. There's going to be a lot of overlap between what I say tonight and what I shared there, but there's a lot of new information, a lot of additional research here. So if you saw that and you're seeing some things that look familiar, don't tune out. There's going to be a lot of new and additional information as well. But so if you look at this brief that the city put out here, their contention basically was that there were just a couple of areas of the city where this number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4 are, that were producing all of the new housing for New York City, or by far the bulk of it, and that the rest of the city was not doing its fair share, lagging behind, and not contributing to the need to create this enormous amount of new housing, and the lack of which was making the city more unaffordable for everybody. And basically, by implication, saying that all of these areas that don't have the dark blue spots need to be dramatically upzoned in order to produce more housing. And that is the basic thinking that we're bumping up against today. And the fact of the matter is that New York City is getting more expensive for the most part, and we do have to do something about it. But the question is, have we accurately identified the causes or the solutions? And I genuinely do not think so, and have spent a huge amount of time looking into and researching this issue, and all evidence seems to say that we have not. So advocates for these upzonings contentions don't really hold up if you look at them on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. And let me share with you some of what I've found. So this is from Property Shark. What they did here was they identified the 10 most expensive neighborhoods in New York based on their records showing sales. If based upon these upzoning advocates' contentions that restricting new housing is what makes prices go up, and allowing huge amounts of new housing to be built is what makes prices go down, well, then you wouldn't see at the top of the list Hudson Yards, which is the largest real estate development in the country right now, where an enormous amount of new housing is being built. You also wouldn't see so prominently on the list these other neighborhoods with red stars next to them that have huge amounts of new construction in them. And where there are not the restrictions that the advocates claim are the cause of unaffordability. And while there are neighborhoods like Tribeca and Soho, which are largely landmarked, where there are some of these kinds of restrictions that these advocates rail against and claim are the cause of our unaffordability problems, it's very telling that Tribeca actually has much higher prices than Soho. Because Tribeca and Soho are very similar neighborhoods. They're right next to each other. It's all, these early 19th century and early 20th century cast iron loft buildings. One of the biggest differences is that Tribeca, at its edges, does actually allow a significant amount of new construction, and some huge new developments have gone up there. So at least until the recent Soho-NoHo rezoning, the restrictions in Tribeca were much less great. And in fact, Tribeca has the higher housing prices, directly contradicting this theory of these advocates. This is from the New York Times. And of course, everybody will kind of cut and slice and dice these housing figures differently. But the Times looked at over the course of a year, 2021 to 2022, which neighborhoods had the greatest increases in housing prices. And as you can see, there's actually a pretty high correlation between neighborhoods with large increases in housing prices and neighborhoods that recently had upzonings or allow significant large-scale new construction, whether it's Hudson Square, Hudson Yards, Gowanus, which was recently rezoned, Greenpoint, Brooklyn. On the other hand, if you look at the neighborhoods where they showed large price decreases, a lot of them are neighborhoods that have very significant restrictions on the size and scale of new development, exactly the kinds of restrictions that these advocates say drive housing prices up. And yet, paradoxically, the East Village, Fisk Terrace, Brooklyn, which is almost entirely landmarked, Brooklyn Heights, also almost entirely landmarked, Soho, also almost entirely landmarked, and until last year's rezoning, had some very specific restrictions on new housing construction. These are all the neighborhoods that have actually seen the largest year-over-year decrease. So again, a lot of evidence indicating that this theory is not correct. Here also from Property Shark, looking a little more widely, is their list of the 50 most expensive neighborhoods in New York City in 2022. And there's some really interesting things that you can glean from this. So first of all, very close to the top is what they call Theater District Times Square, by really by which they just mean the western part of Midtown, 8th to 6th Avenues in the 40s and 50s, very, very high up on there. On the other side of 8th Avenue from that area is Clinton Hell's Kitchen, where I actually happen to live, by the way, which, unlike the Theater District Times Square, where huge amounts of new development take place. Again, this really means all of that part of West Midtown. So the western half of Billionaires Row, where a huge amount of new residential development has gone on. Clinton Hell's Kitchen has these very, very tight restrictions, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, on new development there. So again, based on this theory, these should be flipped exactly. Clinton Hell's Kitchen should have the very, very high prices because of these tight restrictions on new housing development. And what they call Theater District Times Square should actually have very low prices because there's huge amounts of new development that are able to take place there. Of course, that's not what we see. Similarly here, we have three neighborhoods side by side in the parts of Brooklyn closest to Lower Manhattan: downtown Brooklyn, Fort Greene, and Brooklyn Heights. Three neighborhoods, one right next to one another. Fort Greene and Brooklyn Heights are largely landmarked, therefore very limited new construction, depending on how you define the boundaries of Fort Greene, the area right around the new Stadium and Atlantic Yards. There's been a considerable amount of new construction, but for the most part in Fort Greene, very little in Brooklyn Heights. Whereas in downtown Brooklyn, which was rezoned in the early 2000s, there's been an unbelievable amount of new residential construction there. Interestingly, their prices are higher than Fort Greene and Brooklyn Heights, again, contradicting this theory. Here, also 6 neighborhoods in sort of the heart of gentrified Brooklyn, all contiguous to one another. Some of them are very tightly restricted in terms of housing development, because of landmarking. Others are not landmarked and have allowed a considerable amount of new development. And as you can see, there's almost no correlation between whether those restrictions exist or don't exist and whether or not how it impacts the prices. I want to talk quickly about specifically Hell's Kitchen, because Hell's Kitchen is sort of unique in New York City. If you're not familiar with this, it has something called the Special Clinton Zoning District, which was established in the early 1970s, which really tightly restricts new housing development in the neighborhood. And it's designed to make sure that any new construction is similar in size and scale to what's there. It has very tight regulations to ensure that existing housing is not demolished. and it retains the residential character of the neighborhood. There's virtually no neighborhood in New York City that has as tight of restrictions on new development as Hell's Kitchen does. And of course, it's located, right next to Midtown. So for a variety of reasons, it would be considered a very desirable place to live. And one of the reasons why these restrictions were put in place in the early 70s was because there was an awareness that there was going to be this increasing development pressure on this neighborhood. So one of the things that I decided to do was look at, and a little more closely using a different method, what the housing prices are in Hell's Kitchen as compared to the neighborhoods all around it, all of which have seen huge amounts of new housing construction in them. So using Redfin and their accumulations of data on housing sales in the neighborhood, they showed Hell's Kitchen to have a median sale price of about $1.1 million. Now, if you look directly to the south of Hell's Kitchen in Chelsea, where an early 2000s rezoning along the High Line has allowed a huge amount of new construction to take place in that neighborhood, you have average housing prices significantly higher, 1.7 million. Just to the north in Lincoln Square, where along the Riverside, along the waterfront and south of Riverside Park, in that area called Riverside South, there's been a huge amount of new construction. It's one of those big blue areas on that map that I showed you before. You also have higher housing prices than in Hell's Kitchen. This is Hudson Yards, where Redfin shows 1.437 million as the average price. And then just across 8th Avenue from Hell's Kitchen, almost 1.7 million. So again, Hell's Kitchen is the exception. And the thing that's the exception about it, and that's not to say it's a cheap neighborhood by any means, but it's clearly less expensive than all of the neighborhoods all around it, where large amounts of new housing have been produced and encouraged. It's not to say that there's no new housing in Hell's Kitchen, but it's much, much, much more restricted in terms of how that can be built. So I decided, seemed like there was a pretty clear picture being shown here. Maybe that's just sort of a blip of the last year or two or three. Let's look back a little further in time. So here, this is looking at 2017, and it's actually looking at rents as opposed to sales prices. Looking at that lower half of Manhattan, I thought it was interesting to take a look at Hell's Kitchen for the reasons I just described, and the East Village Lower East Side, which is another neighborhood that in the early 2000s, this organization and several other local organizations fought very hard to get something called a contextual rezoning of that neighborhood, which the upzoning advocates hate. And have used to sort of deride, what we do and this sort of policy in terms of how to regulate neighborhoods, saying that it has the result of increasing unaffordability. And it's the exact opposite of what we need to be doing for the city. What it does is doesn't prevent new development from taking place. It keeps it at an appropriate size and scale that's more commensurate, not exactly commensurate, but more commensurate with what's around it. Well, if you look at, and in the upper right-hand corner is a picture of the East Village Lower East Side rezoning. So if you look at this map, you can see that within the context of the lower half of Manhattan, these two neighborhoods that have in many ways, the tightest restrictions on development that the upzoning advocates constantly deride, actually have among the lowest housing prices of any of these neighborhoods. And then moving back even a little bit further, this is also from Property Shark, and this is looking at changes in housing prices from 2004 to 2014. So a different snapshot in time when different things were happening. And what I did was I superimposed on the map with the yellow X areas that had been relatively recently rezoned, upzoned, encouraging, big new residential development. The solid white dots are areas that had recent contextual rezonings. Again, these things that the upzoning advocates are so opposed to. And then the hollow white dot are areas that had previously had these restrictive rezonings. So again, Hell's Kitchen, East Village, Lower East Side for the more restrictive ones, and the neighborhoods that had, at this stage, had recent upzonings were Long Island City, Greenpoint, Williamsburg, and downtown Brooklyn. Well, if you look at this map, it's pretty clear what's going on here. Virtually every neighborhood. Oh, and by the way, Fourth Avenue and Park Slope, which was rezoned in the 2000s to allow huge new development there. So if you look at this map, virtually all of those neighborhoods have pretty significantly higher rates of increase in housing prices, whereas the neighborhoods that had the contextual rezonings or the restrictive rezonings actually had much, much more modest increases, or in one case, a decrease in in housing prices during that time period. So again, there's just a plethora of information refuting this contention. So, I thought, well, maybe that's the way it plays out on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. But if you kind of pull back a little bit further, and if you look at it on a borough by borough basis, maybe we can see this contention that building more housing, upzoning brings prices down, restricting construction makes prices go up. Maybe we would see it happen on a borough by borough basis. But in fact, if you look on a borough by borough basis, you continue to see the exact opposite. And here is an example. If you look at, or an illustration, if you look at, and this is from the NYU Furman Center, if you look at Brooklyn, according to Furman, over this, I believe it's a 10-year time period approximately, the borough with the largest increase in housing prices was Brooklyn. What's interesting about that is that here we go, is that Brooklyn is also, along with Manhattan during this time period, added housing at the highest rate, well above citywide averages, whereas Staten Island added new housing at the slowest rate of the 5 boroughs. Yet, Brooklyn had the highest rate of increase in rents, while Staten Island had the lowest, again, contradicting this theory about how this should be working. And it didn't just affect rents. During that same time period, Brooklyn and Manhattan had the largest decreases in Black and Hispanic shares of their population, with Brooklyn experiencing a net loss of 70,000 Black residents, even as its overall population grew by 9.2%. So one of the contentions that the upzoning advocates make is that, you build more housing, it'll make it easier for people of lower income, people of color to be able to stay in these neighborhoods because it'll decrease the pressure. Well, in fact, we see the exact opposite. Staten Island, on the other hand, with its minimal increase in housing production, actually saw its white population decrease by a larger percentage than any borough, and its Black, Hispanic, and Asian population grow during the same time period. By the way, this is not my way of saying we should all try to follow Staten Island's lead, or that the solution is to restrict new housing construction, but it does point out that there's much evidence contradicting the idea that just increasing housing production is going to positively impact these issues. So looking back a little further, I thought, and I've heard this argument from the upzoning advocates, well, it's really about the region. It's all part of the broader regional area. If you only loosen things up in one place, but keep them tight in another place, it's still going to have the same effect. But you still, even when you look more broadly, you don't see that happen. And a perfect illustration is Jersey City, New Jersey. So upzoning advocates, YIMBY folks, as they're also often called, often point to Jersey City, which is in Hudson County, as the place that does what New York City should be doing. It's producing so much more housing than New York City is on a per capita basis. It's doing what needs to be done to address the housing shortage. And this here speaks to that as well, that their rate of new housing construction has been so much higher than New York City's over the last decade or so. Well, interestingly, apparently during that same time period, Jersey City's housing prices have risen exponentially. driven in part by a huge amount of new luxury housing development. And late last year, it was deemed, based on statistics and data, that it had the highest housing prices of any city in the country. During this time period of explosive housing production, both the number and the percentage of African-American residents of Jersey City also decreased. So there was more housing, more people, but clearly African-American residents were disappearing or being pushed out, while the number and percentage of non-Hispanic white residents increased. Again, stepping back to look at it a little more broadly, maybe somehow this theory plays out on a state-by-state basis, that you can't really see it on the citywide level, but you'll see it play out if you look at the sort of bigger picture. Well, I decided to do that. Let's look at states across the country and which ones have been producing the most housing on a per capita basis. And here is the list of those 10 states that are producing the most housing. So then I decided to try to correlate that with where in the country we've seen the greatest growth in housing prices as well. In other words, where have those prices gone up? Well, I don't think at this point you're going to be too surprised to learn that there is a startlingly high correlation between those states that have been producing the most housing, and this means market rate housing, and those states where the housing prices have been increasing at the greatest rate. In fact, number one is Florida, which is number 3 in terms of producing housing. Number 2 on that list in terms of housing prices going up the most quickly is Arizona. Arizona, as you can see, is number, I believe it's 6 on the list. Utah is number 3 in terms of increasing housing prices. It's number 1 on the list of producing the most housing. The only outlier is Delaware. It's the only one of the top 10 states for producing the most housing where you're not seeing housing prices go up at a higher rate than the national average. That's the only one where it's going up at a lower rate. Every other one is clearly at the upper end of the spectrum. And then again, stepping back even a little further, looking at it on a national basis. So if you talk to people about this issue of the unaffordability of cities and what it is that cities need to be doing, and this theory that it's all about the restriction of housing, they all point to Austin and say, Austin, Texas is doing what we all need to be doing. They are producing housing at the greatest rate of any city in the country. They're churning it out the way we all should be. We should be looking to them as a model. And you can see the Austin metro areas on the top of this list of metropolitan areas across the country that are producing the most housing on a per capita basis. Interestingly, at the same time that is happening, Austin has become one of the least affordable cities in all of the country. And in fact, it's not unique to Austin. If you line up those metropolitan areas with the cities that have the fastest home price growth, you can see, for instance, Phoenix near the top of the list, Tampa, Florida, Dallas, Texas, Seattle, Washington. So clearly, simply increasing the amount of housing that you produce is not only not necessarily going to bring prices down, but in a lot of cases, it seems to coincide with housing prices going up at a much greater rate than the national average. And as a further illustration of this, I thought it was important to look to Houston, because Houston is, of course, famous or infamous for being a city that has no zoning whatsoever. So in many ways, it's among the least regulated city in the country in terms of new development and construction. It's really an outlier in that sense. It's very Texas in that sense, in that they don't have the types of rules and regulations, in many respects, not all, that virtually every other city, municipality, county has. So you would think this lack of restriction and regulation would make Texas a dream in terms of the issue of housing affordability. In fact, what we've seen over the last 10 years is that Houston has seen its real estate prices soar to historic levels. So clearly this idea of, well, we need to get rid of the restrictions doesn't do it. Now, the advocates for this upzoning will say, well, it's not just about market rate housing. Because we have this mandatory inclusionary housing program in New York City, that will mean that there will be affordable housing in this large scale new development that we're going to create. And that really changes the calculation. Unfortunately, as we're going to explore, that's really not true. Mandatory inclusionary housing as a part of the upzoning doesn't help. It may be less bad than a fully market rate upzoning, but it's still worse than no upzoning whatsoever. Why? Because upzonings also provide vastly increased financial incentives to demolish existing rent-regulated housing, eliminating affordable units and displacing long-term residents. That's reason one. We're going to get to a couple of the other reasons, but it's also important to note that after years of mostly doing upzonings for large-scale residential development in areas that were zoned for manufacturing. So on that map before where I showed you the blue dots that the city is saying these are the only parts of the city that's doing what we should all be doing, almost all of those were formerly industrial areas: West Chelsea, Hudson Yards, Williamsburg, Greenpoint Waterfront, Long Island City, not exclusively, Riverside South, that was a rail yard. But these were mostly areas which had fewer residential buildings. But now the powers that be want to do the same thing in residential neighborhoods across the city, which makes this push much more dangerous and with much, much deeper implications for the future of our city and our neighborhoods. So yeah, here's the map. This shows you these were the places that in blue where the big amounts of housing were being created, where those upzonings were, also downtown Brooklyn, which for the most part previously didn't have a ton of residents. Again, not saying none. There was certainly some overlap there. But even with that being the case, if you look at the statistics, during that time period that they tracked, there were actually 17,400 units of housing demolished during that time period. Now, the city will say, yes, and that's unfortunate, but of course, we built so much more housing, so it's on the whole a net gain. And if you're measuring this purely in terms of number of units, during that time period, that's absolutely true. But as we switch the focus from encouraging large-scale residential development in formerly manufacturing zones with few residential units to encouraging large-scale residential development in residential neighborhoods where residential units will be destroyed to make way for the new development, that's going to change the equation significantly. And this ratio that you currently have here, which was that for about every 13 units of new housing, you would lose 1 unit of old housing, that ratio is probably going to change considerably if the city is able to do, and the state, what they are looking to do. It's worth mentioning that MIH upzonings actually increase gentrification, even in wealthy neighborhoods, skewing demographics wealthier and housing costs higher, while accelerating the displacement of the most vulnerable and the least well-off. And let's illustrate how that works. So what sort of residential buildings will be demolished to be replaced by larger MIH buildings with affordable housing? So when you do this kind of stuff in an industrial zone, you're mostly going to lose old industrial buildings, which we could have a whole other conversation about what the downside is to that, but you're not losing housing. However, once you start doing this in residential zones, there's this, I think, mistaken fantasy belief that what's going to happen is that if you do this in wealthy neighborhoods, that somehow the wealthy people are going to be pushed out and replaced by these new MIH developments that are partly market rate, partly affordable. And so you're going to be creating a more diverse, equitable neighborhood. So one question is it single family townhouses that are going to be demolished to make way for these larger MIH buildings? Probably not, for a variety of reasons. One is that there's a restriction or a loophole, I should say, in terms of what triggers the MIH affordable housing requirement. And a building as small as an individual townhouse, there's a very good chance would not be big enough to trigger the MIH requirement, because if the new building is under 12,500 square feet, you don't have to provide any affordable housing whatsoever. And if it's under 25,000 square feet, you don't have to provide any affordable housing either. You just have to pay into a fund. So other possibilities are the co-op and condo buildings, which are usually wealthier people, are these ones that are going to be destroyed if we upzone these residential neighborhoods to make way for new housing? And the answer is that's very unlikely, because it's extremely difficult to get every co-op or condo owner in a building to agree to sell their unit and to allow the building to be demolished to make way for new construction. What about smaller rental buildings with lots of long-term rent-regulated tenants? Yes, this is exactly what's going to get destroyed in residential neighborhoods if you do these large MIH upzonings. Because first of all, they're rentals. So the people who live there don't own them and don't control their fate. And obviously owners who own buildings with rent-regulated tenants in them, not all, there are some good owners out there, but a lot of them want nothing more than to get rid of their rent-regulated tenants, and demolition is a way of doing that. So in fact, if we do these upzonings that are being proposed and considered now in Albany for these neighborhoods, this is what we're going to lose. And this is an illustration of it from a report that we put out during the battle over the Soho, NoHo, Chinatown rezoning. All of these are buildings within that rezoning area that contained rent-regulated housing. And what we did was we showed on the left-hand side what the existing zoning had allowed in terms of the size and scale of new development, and what the new zoning would allow, illustrating how under the old zoning, using this one here, 202 Hester Street as an example, the difference between the existing building and the new zoning was so infinitesimally small that there was no financial incentive to try to demolish that building. Demolishing a building is expensive. It does take work to get those tenants out of there. And then you have to construct a whole new building. And if the new building is only about the same size as the old building, it's not worth it. However, if you can build this building in its place, this much, much larger building, then you have a huge economic incentive to push those tenants out, get rid of those rent-regulated units, and create and build the new building. And this is what you're going to see happen over and over again in areas, even in MIH, mandatory inclusionary housing areas, if we do these kinds of upzonings that the city and state are pushing for right now. Here's a perfect example, 558 Broome Street in Hudson Square. A couple of years ago, it appeared in this article in Curbed about the 5 cheapest rentals in Manhattan's most expensive neighborhood. In 2017, a quarter of the units were still rent stabilized, and 2 of the 5 of them were the cheapest rentals in the area as reported by Curbed. Just earlier this year, of course, Hudson Square was upzoned several years ago, so creating huge incentives to demolish buildings like this. And so early this year, they filed demolition permits for this building. So this building and its cheap housing and its residents will soon be not much longer for this world. And the loss of rent stabilized units is much more than theoretical. This is just looking at the sort of the lower half of Manhattan, which I used partly because it's among the areas that the city is most focused on doing these massive upzonings for. And as you can see on these community boards, so there's 135,000 units, 136 really, of rent-regulated units in these neighborhoods. All of them have quite a few, very, very highly concentrated in places like the Upper West Side, number 7 here. But even in the East Village, there's 8,000, almost 9,000 units in the East Village alone. Stuyvesant Town is also a big reservoir of rent-stabilized units. And by upzoning these neighborhoods, with the exception of a sort of special situation like Stuyvesant Town, which is not likely to be demolished anytime soon, you are putting these housing units at risk, which largely have longer term residents. Not everybody who lives in a rent regulated unit is poor, but they definitely tend to be less well off. And they range from the poor to the middle class to some more well-to-do people who've lucked into a rent regulated unit. But the fact of the matter is that this is affordable housing, and it does in a lot of cases house people who are less well off or more modest incomes than many of their neighbors. But what we are seeing is that there's been this huge disappearance of rent regulated units in our neighborhoods. And this map produced by the city really illustrates it. The orange points are between just 2019 and 2021 buildings that have seen a reduction in the number of rent regulated units registered there. And the sort of more yellowish orange ones are where the buildings just didn't register for rent regulation at all during that time period. Now, not all of these are from demolitions. In fact, I'm sure most of them aren't, but that's a factor. And I'm sure that in a lot of these cases, these are buildings that are being gradually emptied with the idea of demolishing them for new construction. Now, it's also worth pointing out that sometimes these big new buildings not only displace longtime residents, destroy affordable housing, and make the neighborhoods more expensive, wealthy, and homogenous. Sometimes they also actually reduce the amount of housing in spite of their size. So even if you accept this argument that it's all about how much new housing are we building, these upzonings sometimes actually result in less housing than had been there before. So here's some examples. This is not an upzoning, but this is an area of Greenwich Village that has very, very, very dense housing. It's supposed to be protected by landmark designation, and it is landmarked, but the Landmarks Preservation Commission, in its infinite wisdom, and I say that with complete sarcasm, decided that this building didn't merit landmark, the protections typically associated with landmark designation, and allowed it to be demolished. And the building to the right is what it was replaced with. So the building on the left was a 4.5-story building with 20 units, 10 of which were rent stabilized. The new building now going up, which has been in the news lately because it has almost resulted in the destruction of the building 2 doors down from it, a 21-story building, so about 5 times the size of the old building, would only have 17 units in it, none of them affordable. And this is a phenomenon that's not unique to Greenwich Village. There was a story in the Times recently about this phenomenon focusing on the Upper East and the Upper West Side. It's a 210-foot tall tower on East 86th Street with only 14 apartments in it. It replaced a pair of low-rise buildings with 10 apartments, so a very modest increase in the number of housing units there, a huge decrease in the amount of light and air, and a huge increase in the price of housing there. But here are ones where the numbers of units just came down. Here on 96th Street, a 321-foot tall tower with 21 condo units that replaced rental buildings with 30 apartments. This one here also on the Upper East Side, where you're going to have a 214-foot tall high-rise with 36 units. They raised a bunch of 5-story walk-up buildings that had 40 rental apartments in them. I'm sure some of them had been rent stabilized. This one here, 11 units going up, replacing a 5-story rent stabilized building. I'm sure it had at least 11 units of housing in it or something in that neighborhood. So this is unfortunately probably our future if these upzonings happen. And it's worth looking at the example of the Upper East Side, which if you looked more closely at that map that the city provided, the Upper East Side showed a very interesting dynamic, which was that there was a considerable amount of new housing construction on the Upper East Side, but between demolitions and alterations, they lost about as many units as they created. And that's because, at least in terms of the high demolition number, because the Upper East Side is one of the few neighborhoods that already has the massive zoning differential, at least in some areas, between existing residential buildings and what can be built, leading to large numbers of residential demolition. So in other words, the Upper East Side is a bit of a window into our upzoned future in terms of what that might look like, because at least in some parts of the neighborhood, they have very, very, very high density zoning governing areas that still have or had a lot of low-rise buildings in them. Let me see if I can forward here. All right. So let's talk about mandatory inclusionary housing, which these advocates will say, well, this is the program that's going to replace it, and this is going to make everything better. How does it actually work? What is its effect on housing prices and the income level of residents? So here's what mandatory inclusionary housing is. There's three different versions of it. One is 70% market rate, 30% affordable. One is 25% market rate, 75% market rate, 25% affordable. And one is 80% market rate, 20% deeply affordable. Basically, the more affordable units there are, the less affordable they are. And the affordability, as you can see here, for the 30%, they have to average out to 80% of AMI, which means area median income. 25%, they have to average out to 60% of area median income, and the 20% deeply affordable are 40% of area median income. Now, you're probably thinking, well, 40% of area median income, that actually does sound like it's reaching some pretty needy people. Let's dig a little deeper and see what this really means. So let's use this as an example. The one in the middle, because it's sort of the most commonly used one, and it's the one that really is kind of the average of the other two. The advocates for MIH will often point out that while it requires an average of 60% of AMI, it also requires that at least 10% of those units be at 40% or below, which of course sounds, incredibly low, that this must be for, sort of super poor people. What they don't say is that also means that at least 10% of the units are at 80% of AMI or above, because the average is 60%. Now, what does that really mean? So first of all, advocates for mandatory inclusionary housing will often try to leave you with the impression that this is what mandatory inclusionary housing means, that if you don't have it, it's what you have on the left, which is 100% market rate. And if you do have it, it's what you have on the right, which is 75% market rate, 25% affordable. And really, it's the same thing as you would have had otherwise, except 25% of the units are affordable. There are, in fact, some jurisdictions, not New York City, that do this, where they require any new construction, housing construction, to have a certain set aside of affordable housing. But that is not what mandatory inclusionary housing in New York City is. This is what mandatory inclusionary housing in New York City is. It typically requires about a doubling or more of the allowable size of residential development. So it's not that it's just saying, well, the new building that you're going to get anyway is now going to include a certain percentage of affordable units. It's saying the building that you were going to get is now going to be massively larger than it would have been, with a fraction of that as affordable housing. And in fact, there's going to be a lot more market rate housing. This is why the real estate industry loves MIH and loves upzonings that require MIH, because even though there's this affordable housing requirement, which, by the way, in some circumstances you can get around, and affordable, quote unquote, we'll get to what that really means. This here, the market rate housing that they make all of the money on, they get to build so much more of it anyway under the MIH schemes. So what is the affordable housing in these MIH schemes? The income restrictions only apply when you move in, and rent increases are restricted based upon rent stabilization. So whatever your income is when you qualify, that your income when you're applying is what determines what sort of unit you get. What if your income increases after you've moved in, it doesn't affect what your rent is, and it doesn't affect your ability to hold on to that apartment. So if you move into one of these apartments that are supposed to be for people at 40% of AMI or 60% of AMI, and at some point after you've moved in, you start making a lot more money, you still get that. That's still your unit for life, and the rent is still kept at the levels that were created for people at that original low income level. So as I said before, you get approximately double the amount of market rate housing you would get without an MIH upzoning. And the market rate housing in general we find typically sells for well above or rents for well above average prices in its community. Now, it's a little hard to get comprehensive statistics about this in terms of, what does new market rate housing in New York City cost as compared to housing costs overall in New York City. But certainly from the research I've done, every place I've looked in general, no matter what neighborhood it is, new market rate housing tends to be significantly more expensive than housing overall in that neighborhood. And we did a more in-depth study of this for the Soho NoHo rezoning. In that rezoning area, we found that it was the price of housing, of new market rate housing being constructed in those neighborhoods was about 4 times as high as the housing prices in those neighborhoods overall. So in other words, new market rate housing, the people who were going to move into that new market rate housing were, and this is being incredibly generous, they were the equivalent of the wealthiest 1/3 of the existing neighborhood, and probably it was more in the neighborhood of the wealthiest 10% or less of the neighborhood are the people who could afford to move into new market rate developments. So here, let's look at a little bit more in a little more depth at what the affordable component of those MIH developments means. So on the 30% side, it means 80% of AMI is $96,000 for a family of 3. Now, in New York City, the median household income is actually only $70,000. So that 80% of AMI for a family of 3 is actually well above what the average New York City resident makes. For the 25% affordable, so some of it is going to be at 80% of AMI, which, as I said before, is 96,000. Some of it is going to be at 60% AMI, which is about 72,000. So now you're getting to just really the average New Yorker. So this affordable unit is really just something an average New Yorker can get. It's not a poorer than average New Yorker. And the folks at the 40% of AMI, so that's $48,000 a year for a family of 3. So that is less than average for New York City residents, although certainly it's not the most neediest New Yorkers. And then as you can sort of extrapolate for the ones where it's 20% deeply affordable, where it has to average out to 40% of AMI. So again, that's 48,000 versus 70,000. So you're probably wondering, why is it that these numbers are so different than what should be the, sort of average income for New Yorkers? So MIH is based on what's called the area median income that's used for New York City. But it's not for New York City. It's used by New York City, and it's used for New York City, but it doesn't cover just New York City. It actually includes wealthy Westchester County and other lower Hudson Valley counties, these affluent suburban counties, where median incomes are typically 50% or more above what they are in New York City. So this area that they're basing these numbers on are not New York City, but New York City plus about 5 different wealthy suburban counties. So that's why 100% AMI, meaning the median income for the area that the city uses to peg these MIH affordable units, is actually $120,000 for a family of 3. Now, the MIH stuff, it's all based on family size. The average household size in New York City is about 2.7. So the closest analog for the sort of average New York City household would be 3 or a little bit under. So the median household under AMI is 120,000, but it's only 70,000 for the median household income for New York City. So It's not 100% apples to apples comparison because the AMI is for 2022. That 70,000 is for 2021. And that's a 3-person household versus a 2.7-person household. As you can see, it gradually goes up the larger the number of units. But it's a pretty good analog, and it's pretty telling that the real median household income for New York City is about 70,000, whereas what they use as the median household income for area median income is 120,000, which is more than 50% more. Very large difference. So let's look a little bit more closely at how that then therefore plays out and whether or not this low income housing that's included in this MIH, what does it do in terms of how does it affect housing in New York City? So if you here is what 40% of AMI is. So 40% of AMI, if you have an MIH development where the housing is reserved for people at 40% of AMI, it's going to be 20% of the units. So you would want or hope that for New York City that that level, that $48,000 a year, would be higher than what the poorest 20% of city residents earn. Because if it's not, then it means that even your low-income housing is more expensive in housing wealthier people than the people in the city as a whole. But in fact, that's not the case. It's actually nearly 40% of New Yorkers who earn $48,000 or less. It's 54% of New Yorkers who earn $72,000 or less. So you would want this to be 25% or lower. In fact, it's 54. And 30% here, because that's where you get the 80% AMI of 98,000, it's actually 65.2% of New York City residents who earn that income level or lower. So in other words, the quote unquote affordable housing is actually much less affordable than reflects the population of the city as a whole. You would want, if you have 25% affordable housing as part of your new development, for it to be affordable to at least 25% of the city, and it's not. Similarly, 30% or 20%. So I decided to look at some wealthier neighborhoods in New York City, neighborhoods such as ours, to see how these numbers played out there, and whether or not, at least in these more well-to-do neighborhoods in the center of Manhattan, if even there the numbers worked out in such a way that the affordable housing being provided by MIH was going to be more provide affordable housing for a larger percentage of the population than made that amount of money. And in every case, it did not work out that way. So for this income level here, which is what 20% of an MIH development includes, is up to this income level. This actually is 24.1%. This is the Upper West Side of Manhattan. 24% of the residents of the Upper West Side of Manhattan make less than that amount. The 25% version of MIH, it's actually 33% that make less than that amount. And the 30% version, it's 42%. So in every case, and I went through neighborhood after neighborhood, this is Chelsea Hell's Kitchen, this is East Midtown Murray Hill. The numbers, again, it's always greater, even in these wealthy neighborhoods. So here again, there are more poorer people at lower income levels than the commensurate amount of the low income housing that these new developments will include. So here's a visual way of sort of comparing them. On the left is mandatory inclusionary housing, and on the right are our existing neighborhoods. So you have the 70 to 80% of an MIH development is going to be market rate, 20 to 30% are affordable. So we divided New York City into 70 to 80%, the top 70 to 80% and the bottom 20 to 30%. So if MIH was just sort of perpetuating the same income variation that you have in New York City, the income levels for the 70 to 80% market rate would be equal to the income levels for the top 70 to 80% of income earners in New York City, and the 20 to 30% of the units that are of the MIH that's affordable, those people would be making the same as the bottom 20 to 30% of income earners in New York City. That's if you were just sort of repeating the income spectrum that you have in New York City, not making it better, not making it more accessible, not bringing in more people of modest means, just keeping things as they are. And so this illustration here shows if you were actually doing that, if MIH were making the city more equitable, the people who lived in the 70 to 80% market rate housing, their income levels would be lower than the top 70 to 80% of income earners in New York City. And the people in the 20 to 30% of affordable housing, their income levels would be lower than the bottom 20 to 30% of income earners in New York City. But actually, we see the exact opposite, which is that the market rate housing is going to produce housing that only people in the uppermost portion of the New York City socioeconomic spectrum can live in, not the top 70 to 80% that are here, but a much, much smaller fraction of New York City residents can afford to live in that 70 to 80% of an MIH development that's market rate. And the affordable units are actually only affordable to people who are much more wealthy than the lowest 20 to 30%. So in fact, this quote unquote affordable housing, which should be serving at the very least the lowest 20 to 30% of income earners in New York City, actually is affordable to a much more wealthy segment of the New York City population. So clearly, MIH doesn't do what it promises to do on a citywide basis. So I decided to look and see if there were actually any community boards anywhere in New York City where it did what it was supposed to do, or what it claimed to do, which is that it would make for housing that was more equitable, more accessible, more affordable with people of more modest means than in the community board in which it would be located. So I took a look at version 1, where you had 30% affordable, which again means an average of 80% of AMI. And I wanted to see if there was any community board in New York City where you had that 80% of AMI was what the lowest 30% of residents, the least well-off 30% of residents, could afford 80% of AMI. Not a single community board in all of New York City was that the case. So there's no community board in New York City where the 30% version of MIH makes sense. It's much less than the lowest 30% of the neighborhood that can afford the affordable housing. So then I took a look at version 2 with the 25% affordable housing at an average of 60% of AMI. Of all of New York City's 59 community boards, there was only one that just barely arguably fit, and that is the wealthiest community board in New York City, Community Board 1, the lower tip of Manhattan, Tribeca, Battery Park City Financial District. And really there, it was about roughly equal, that the least well-off 25% approximately of the neighborhood earned between 0% of AMI and 60% of AMI. So even that doesn't really fit. But if you're being as generous as possible towards AMI, towards MIH, you could argue that it maybe kind of almost makes sense. But that lowest 25%, they have to average out to 60% of AMI. In this community board here, the lowest 25% of income earners earn between 0% of AMI and 60% of AMI. And then lastly, the version that's 20% with deeply affordable housing, as they call it, 40% of AMI, which again is $48,000, an household income of $48,000 a year. There were only two community boards, again, the two richest community boards in New York City, the Upper East Side and Community Board 1, Financial District Tribeca, that even came close to meeting it. And again, it was in a very, very similar way. It was roughly 20% of the residents of that neighborhood earned between 0 and 40, but actually the MIH would require them all to earn on average 40, not between 40 and 0. So these are the only ones that even come close to sort of touching what would be considered maybe making sense in terms of meeting the income needs of the neighborhood, and even there, it really does actually fall short. We also did a survey of as many of the MIH developments that we could find across New York City. And it's even more striking how mismatched the affordable units are in poorer areas of New York City, such as Ocean Hill and East New York. So in East New York, Brooklyn, we found that several of the required affordable units in MIH developments actually charged as much or higher rents than the market rate ones did. I mean, think about that. These are the units that are regulated, that the income levels are set, the rents are set because they're supposed to be serving those most in need, and they're actually more expensive than the market rate units. And one example was 2178 Bergen Street, where you found a 2-bedroom market rate unit rented for $21.93, whereas the required 2-bedroom affordable units rented for $2,400. So that really gives you a sense of how this works. And then we could have a whole presentation just on this, but I'll note that we also looked at how MIH developments were likely to play out in Soho, NoHo, and Chinatown in terms of the racial diversity of residents. And we actually found that it was a reasonable prediction that it would make for developments that were less racially diverse than the city as a whole. Than the neighborhood, not the city as a whole, than that neighborhood as a whole. And that was assuming that it didn't use what's called community preference. So something that's attached to MIH is that for those affordable units, half of them are required to go to people who live in the current community board, or I believe within maybe a half mile of it. So that really limits who can access that affordable housing. When you add in that restriction, of course, you're making it even that much less likely that you're going to create you're going to add diversity to that neighborhood. So these comparisons here, these are two different models we used. One was using an income model based on the borough of Manhattan, assuming that the people who would access the affordable housing would be reflective of income levels, for the required income levels, and what those people look like if they lived in Manhattan. And this one was based on the required income levels, and what they look like for people who live citywide. Either way, for the most part, less diverse than the existing neighborhood. But if you were to factor in community preference, it becomes even less diverse still. So one last area that I want to hit on is that these upzoning plans that the city and state are putting forward are based on a couple of premises, foundational to their sort of thinking about what the issue is that we face. And it is that the city's population is growing, that we've added lots of jobs in recent years, but not enough housing to keep up, and that current zoning doesn't allow us to add enough housing. So let's actually dig down a little bit deeper and see if some of those assumptions are correct. So New York City's population was growing during the 2010s. Everybody was very celebratory about the fact that the population hit 8.8 million. But unfortunately, what's happened in the 2 years since then is that the population has cratered. It dropped 4% in 2021. And in 2022, this was an estimate from the middle of the year. It was continuing to drop at an even higher rate. 4.2%, and according to the Empire Center, was down to just 8.287 million by July of 2022. One of the major drivers of population growth in New York City is immigration. And as many of you know, immigration to the country has been slowed to a trickle for a variety of reasons. And so the likelihood of that number ticking back up anytime soon is somewhat in doubt. Let me advance the slide. We also, while we did add a huge number of jobs in the 2010s, unfortunately, when COVID hit, we lost almost 1 million of them. We haven't gained them all back yet. So part of this, in fact, a significant number of them, we haven't. And with post-COVID changes and other factors, employment and population trends for New York City are still very much up in the air. And it's unclear if some of those jobs are going to come back because now they're more mobile than they used to be. It's unclear if some of those people are going to come back because they're more mobile than they used to be. But either way, it's worth pointing out that some of those jobs, many of the jobs that are created in New York City, it's not like they all go to New York City residents. A significant number of jobs in New York City are filled by people who live throughout the tri-state region. So the imperative to create housing for every new job that we create has to be seen through the lens of the fact that a lot of those jobs actually go to people who live outside of the city. And in fact, whatever you want to say about New York City in terms of the amount of housing production, whether we should do more or do less, it's a simple fact that the suburbs outside of New York City are producing housing at a much, much, much slower pace than the city is. You can see here, in some cases, about a third of the rate to at most half of the rate of what the city is. So in terms of the issue of the need to create housing to keep up with the number of jobs we've created, clearly the suburbs are the ones that need to be doing much more in that regard and should probably be our primary focus if we do in fact believe that we do need to create more housing. And I certainly agree that when more jobs are created in the region, more housing needs to be created. But it seems as though it's really the suburbs that have been falling down most heavily on the job on that account. So finally, in conclusion, I just want to say that it's not a choice between MIH upzonings and doing nothing, which is what the proponents of upzonings will say. They'll say, well, you folks just want to do nothing and we can't just do nothing. Because in fact, it's true that doing nothing likely means a slow and continuing slide towards unaffordability. But MIH upzonings means a vastly accelerated rate of gentrification and displacement while losing neighborhood scale, character, history, and continuity. So instead of saying that it's a choice between MIH upzonings and doing nothings, here's some of the things that we have supported and believe we can do. One is we can do more to preserve existing affordable housing, which, as you could see from that slide I showed earlier, in the case of rent-regulated housing, is disappearing, and it's disappearing at an alarming rate. We can convert office, disused or underutilized office space to residential uses and mandate the inclusion of affordable housing. There's been a lot of talk about doing this, but we haven't done it yet. Hopefully that will happen. Certainly we believe that the focus should be on actually building affordable housing, not building massive amounts of luxury housing that we hope will, lower prices for everybody, not building massive amounts of luxury housing where we claw back a percentage of affordable housing, but building actual affordable housing developments. Right-sized ones in neighborhoods, in every neighborhood, ones that fit the scale, fit the character of the neighborhood, and are as close to 100% affordable as possible. Clearly, the issue of unit size is an issue. I hit on that briefly when we looked at those buildings that have fewer units than the much smaller buildings that they replace. If we continue to allow people to build these new developments with 6,000 or 7,000 square foot unit apartments, they're going to continue to eat up our housing. And another thing that we can look at is community land trusts, which Village Preservation is one of scores of groups across the city that support this movement to create community land trusts, which would allow city-owned property when it's being given away, sold, utilized, that the first crack at it would go to these community land trusts, which would utilize it for affordable housing. So hopefully that was useful for you to think about. I'm really interested to hear the Q&A and respond to some questions, but I want to, and we're going to start with the Q&A now, but what I'd really like to do is ask you to scan this QR code, which is on your screen. And Leanne, I'll ask you to drop that link in the chat that I had shared with you. Big decisions are going to be made this week in Albany around this set of issues that we're discussing. The state legislature is looking at lifting that longstanding FAR cap, which would allow the city to rezone any neighborhood in New York City that they wanted to allow massively scaled new residential development. We need to tell state legislatures not to lift that FAR cap. And if you go to our webpage that this QR code will take you to, or the link in the chat, which hopefully Leanne has dropped, will give you, with just a couple of clicks, you can fill out that letter and send it to every city and state official who needs to hear from you about this, to tell them that you do not want to see that happen. So let me now turn to the Q&A. And so if you haven't already, drop your questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to take a look at them now and try to respond to some of them. Let's see. So one question from someone I know was, what was the rationale in the 60s for the residential cap, and does that rationale still apply? That's a really good question, and I haven't been able to get an answer to that. There's kind of a lot of different theories that I've heard about why the cap was created in the 1960s, in the early 1960s. I believe it was the early 1960s, around the time of the 1961 zoning resolution. I think it happened during that kind of period of a lot of reforms that took place in response to Robert Moses and his huge plans for mega developments across the city. But I don't have an answer to that. I'd be interested to know. What I would say is, regardless of what the rationale was for it at the time, it clearly fills an important purpose now, which is that it keeps the city from doing what I think would be some pretty terrible stuff, which is to allow neighborhoods to be upzoned even beyond the massive scale that current zoning allows them to do. And we all know how big those buildings on Billionaires Row and on the Long Island City waterfront and the Jenga building and all these other things are. If you truly think that those buildings are not big enough and that we need to have residential buildings that are bigger than that, then I would say support lifting the FAR cap. And I'm sure some of the sort of YIMBY folks out there would say, yes, that's the case. But if you think that that's big enough, then I would say support keeping that cap in place. I see one question from somebody who says they'd like to have a copy of this. This entire presentation is being recorded, and we will share the recording with everybody who RSVP'd. It'll go up on our website, and it'll also go on our YouTube page, so you'll be able to see that soon and share it, and I hope that you will. Let's see, here's another question. I thought that lifting the FAR cap would only be for high density commercial districts in Midtown office districts to allow conversion of office buildings to residential. No. If the FAR cap is lifted by the state, it allows the city to zone to any level of density that they want anywhere. There are currently no requirements attached to it whatsoever. It is separate from the question of whether or not large old commercial buildings, office buildings, can be converted to residential uses. So I understand it might be easy to kind of conflate the two or think that there's a relationship between them. There is not. If that FAR cap is lifted, it means that the city can rezone any neighborhood it wants for huge development. Okay, let's see some other questions. What is the time frame for this to get voted on in Albany? So the two houses of the state legislature, the Assembly and the Senate, are going to be producing what are called their one-house bills next week, I believe on the 13th. That will, if this lifting the FAR cap is in either or both houses, one house's bill, that means it's still very much alive. If it doesn't make it into any of those one house bills, then there's a good chance it's dead for the session. But the final answer won't come until a couple of weeks later. But what happens next week, whether or not it gets into those one house bills, is going to tell us a lot about whether or not it's barely breathing or still very much alive. What is REBNY doing on this is one question. So REBNY, of course, wants that FAR cap lifted. They want upzonings in as many areas as possible. They want to remove as many of these restrictions that I've talked about in places like Hell's Kitchen, in places like the East Village, landmarking restrictions. They want to get rid of as many of them as possible. And REBNY has certainly been lobbying for that. Let's see, other questions. Okay. Let's see, affordable apartments are too small to be able to share with a roommate. I think that sort of really depends. Let's see. Okay, sorry. So one question here that I see is, why does the city not still create zoning restrictions like they did in places like Hell's Kitchen and in the East Village? Which is a really good question, because in fact, what the housing regulations for Hell's Kitchen have, while they're not perfect, they certainly have not made Hell's Kitchen affordable to everybody in perpetuity, but they have helped to keep Hell's Kitchen much more diverse and much more affordable than one would have expected a neighborhood in this location to be. The city for several administrations now has said, we don't want to do more of those kinds of zoning districts that have these requirements about how you can't demolish residential buildings. There's penalties if you harass tenants. New construction has to be in scale with the existing housing. There's disincentives built in to make sure that anybody who ever harasses a tenant can't profit from it in the future. The city has unfortunately really said, we don't want to do that anymore. So it's really just a matter of political will, but the political will has not been there for a long time. And even something much, much, much more modest, like what was done in the East Village and Lower East Side, where it was really just contextual zoning that said that new development, instead of being tall towers, needed to be kind of squatter, fatter buildings that looked a little bit more like the buildings that were there, and encouraged residential development, because previously the East Village had zoning that encouraged university dormitories. So we were getting NYU dorms and New York Law School dorms and all these other things. So it's not like it prevented new housing from being built. It just said, when you build it, it's got to, kind of look a little bit more like the rest of the neighborhood. And we're going to put in some incentives for including affordable housing, which it created some of, not nearly as much as folks were hoping for. There as well, since the de Blasio administration, there's been a policy of we're not doing those kinds of rezonings anymore. And again, it's just a matter of political will. We really do need to try to push the city to get back to a place where they will consider things like that. So let me see if there's any other questions there. Have these slides? Yes, slides will be shared. Let's see what else. How did the East Village and Lower East Side get the restrictions it has? Now I understand. The way in which the East Village and Lower East Side got those restrictions was because groups like ours were part of a big coalition of groups that proposed it, fought for it, and pushed for it. It was everything from housing groups to neighborhood groups to small business groups to historic preservation groups. And it was in 2008, I believe, that we were able to get that done. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't everything that we wanted. It left some areas out that we wanted. It didn't go as far as we would have liked, but it made a difference. It certainly pushed things in the right direction. Now that I'm on Social Security, I don't have enough income for any affordable apartment. I hear you. And in fact, the MIH, standard MIH at least, typically does not reach the people most in need. And in fact, as you could see by the information that I shared, it typically, a lot of what it's geared towards are people who are right in the middle for New York City, or even above the middle. And by the way, this doesn't even show there's other versions of affordable housing programs that the city has where MIH goes to at most an average of 80%. So by the way, that means that some of them could be 100%, some of them could be 60. And remember that 80% is well above the median income for New York City. So if some of them are 100%, then you're getting to even further above the median income. There are some housing programs that the city has where it actually goes up to 165% of AMI, and that's not 165% of the average income in New York City. Let me pull that thing back up. That's 165 for the area. So 165 AMI. Let me see, is that even yeah, here we go. So for a family of three, we're talking $200,000. So there's definitely a lot of stuff that gets called affordable that I would say that is debatable at best. And not just because, look, there's not everything is going to serve every person in need. You can't expect every single housing development to do that. But by what are some pretty reasonable definitions of affordable, a lot of this stuff, it doesn't really make sense to call it affordable. One question here, is there any hope, or should I start packing my bags? Do any of the legislators oppose this proposal? Yes, and in fact, regarding the lifting the FAR cap, we, working with others, have been able to stop this from being lifted several times in the past, when the mayor was lobbying for it, when Rebney was lobbying for it, when the governor was lobbying for it. So there is hope. It's definitely probably at its most precarious point this year, but this is not a pie in the sky. We've done this before, and I'm cautiously optimistic that we can do it again this year. So please do send send those letters in. So here's one question. Do you realize that comparing average sales prices for housing units without assuring equivalence of housing units is not an apples to apples comparison? Of course, an unsubsidized newly constructed unit is going to cost more than a much older unit. Yes, that is exactly right. I have a feeling there's a lot that we don't agree on, but we do agree on that. But that's part of the point, which is that these shiny new units in these big new buildings that are, sort of tricked out with all of these amenities, the gyms, the concierges, the what have you. Yeah, they sell for a lot more money than the older units because the older units are not as fancy often. Some old units can be very fancy, but, mostly newer units skew fancier, more amenity packed. Older units skew less fancy, less amenity packed. And that's why the tendency when you're building lots and lots of new market rate housing is you're tending to increase housing prices. And you see it everywhere, whether it's Austin, as we looked at Utah, Florida, Williamsburg, Greenpoint. That's what's going to happen when you increase the amount of new market rate housing. And by the way, that's not my saying we shouldn't build new market rate housing. We should. Existing zoning allows us to build a ton of new market rate housing, and I don't have a problem with that. What I do have a problem with is these plans that would massively increase the amount of new market rate housing that we would produce and result in the demolition and destruction of the old housing that we do have, which is in many cases good, solid housing. That it's greener to keep an existing building than to demolish it and build a new one. One of the least one of the most carbon impactful things you can do is demolish a building and build a new building, and that's going to displace the people who lived in it and get rid of the rent-regulated affordable housing, which in many cases was there before. So let me see, we're at 7:30. I want to see if there's any new. Why is there not better alignment between AMI and New York City's real income levels? I heard there were recent discussions about this. I'm not sure about why this is the case. I've heard the city say things like they have to use the AMI, but what they're not. So let's say they had to use the AMI. Let's say this was what they had to use, knowing that what in fact is the median income for city residents is really something much closer to 60% AMI than 100% AMI. The city could choose to use 60 as its base and say affordable housing is only going to be things that are significantly below 60% AMI. So there's nothing that's forcing the city to do this, even if they have to use this numbering system. It's the substance of it that really is what is the difference. They're choosing to peg it to numbers that they believe will sound like they're serving the needier residents of New York City when really they're not. So that's just a choice on their part. Let's see. Does real estate development really help the city tax base to the extent we're told it does? Developers forego years of income, spend wildly for years, and receive years of tax abatement. These are all good points. I think it varies from case to case. One of the things that we've pushed back against is that so many of these new developments are actually not even people's real homes. So they're not paying resident income tax, even though they've bought the unit, because it's one of 3, 4, 5 different homes that they own, and it's not their primary residence. So there's a lot of ways in which these don't contribute to the economic well-being of the city in ways in which one would hope they would. What happens to the tenants whose existing housing is demolished? Is there a process to ensure they get replacement housing? So if you're not in rent-regulated housing, for the most part, you lose your housing. That's the end of it. If you're in rent-regulated housing, you are supposed to be given new housing. If you do it sort of on the up and up and go through the process. However, what more typically happens is they kind of just push, cajole, harass, or buy out those tenants who just don't feel that it's viable to hang on and stay or to fight to get the new replacement housing. So in a very, very significant percentage of those cases, they don't get new replacement housing. Sometimes they don't get anything. At best, sometimes they get a one-time buyout, which rarely is sufficient to make up for what they lost. Let me see. Every AMI figure in New York City across government programs is inclusive of Westchester and other suburban areas. I don't know if this AMI is used for every other program, but I know that we've been told by the city that this is the standard area median income measure to use, and it does include Westchester, Putnam, Rockland, and a few other counties just to the north. So I think that's it in terms of all of the questions. So thank you very much, everybody, for sticking around. I know we ran a little bit longer than we said we would. I hope this was useful. I hope you will or have sent those letters to state legislators. And when we send the link to the video around, I hope you will pass it along and share it with others, because this is incredibly important information that we really need to get out there to folks. So thank you again. And thank you for your support of what we do. And again, if you like what we do, please make a contribution to Village Preservation, become a member, and help us to keep doing what we're doing. And I'm bringing us back up to that QR code at the beginning. Here we go. If you scan that QR code, that will allow you to make a donation in support of our work. So again, thank you very much, everybody, and have a good night.